thanks everybody for joining. I'm looking forward to hearing from Tyler Volk, who we have delightfully had join the Institute of Applied Metatheory as part of a project that you're doing, Greg, in natural philosophy. And it's been really great to get to know your work, Tyler. I've gotten through your latest work. I think it's your latest work, From Quarks to Culture, which is a really cool book on the exposition of all, to pick up your term, Larry, kind of like an orders of nature, and how does that unfold? And so there's definitely there's a theme that runs through the work that we do, and looking very much forward to hearing about combogenesis and sort of what your work has found, Tyler, in that whole area. I think that's going to be of great interest to the Institute. So thanks for being here. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, you're welcome. Well, thanks, Brendan, for the invite and to everybody who attended. So, just a bit of background. I was a professor at New York University for, I guess, for 35 years. I was in departments, applied science, earth system science, biology, environmental studies. Some of these were closed departments, renamed departments. I ended up being half in biology and half in environmental studies. I'm currently emeritus professor. My bachelor's degree was in architecture in 1971, University of Michigan, and I bring that up because architecture was a fantastic systems thinking training, and it went all the way from engineering of structures to thinking about cities to actually human psychology. So I really liked the full suite of what architecture gave me. I did not become an architect, obviously. I went into my PhD was involving the global carbon cycle and looking at the role of life on a global scale in the carbon cycle. But I continued interest across multiple scales. It seems to have never ended. Some of the ideas I had in my mid-20s, and I was thinking about patterns that span from biology into human psychology, and that became the book Metapatterns in with Columbia University Press. I borrowed the word from Gregory Bateson. And Brendan had asked me, could I say some words about Gaia theory today? And that made me think I should do a little bit of a survey. So that's my book, Gaia's Body. But there were many technical papers. I won't talk about the intertwining of death and life. I will not talk about CO2, but I will bring in quarks to culture. I think there's I can make a segues between Metapatterns, Gaia's Body, and quarks to culture. And thinking specifically about this group and the applied meta theory project, I think there's three main messages or discussion topics today. One would be the concept of a systemese, a language of systems that's in the mind and maybe that nature uses also. And that's not my term, but I'll bring up George Mobus later. The second is kinds of evolution. In this, I will go into work that Greg and I did together. I'm very, very proud to have published that paper in the Journal of Big History with Greg. And I want to try to emphasize what that might mean to think for the meta theory project of kinds of evolution. And then at the end, a little bit about what I'm now calling Patternland, which is as I continue this work, the word I'm giving to it. So this was meta patterns. This was actually something similar to a book jacket that I wanted Columbia University Press to do, but they didn't like it. They said it was too explicit. So we settled there was just a Zen Enso at the end, which I was fine with. But we had a little bit of a, you know, tiff back and forth as the author started being a, complaining type author rather than letting the artists do their things. But now I can show it fully. And the meta patterns going around from systems to relationships, borders, two part systems or dyads. I was calling them binaries at the time. Centered versus distributed, holarchy versus hierarchy, or that would be nested systems versus more like networked systems, I guess. That had sub all these were chapters of the book. Time structure it dealt with calendars and how humans structure time. And then there were three main meta patterns of time: arrows, breaks, and cycles. And what I did in the book was to go from physics, chemistry into biology, into culture, architecture, mythology, structures of technology, the structures of science, but then also some about human psychology, bringing in, for example, in the chapter, thank you, Greg, the chapter on borders, brought in Lakoff and Johnson's container metaphor, for example, the way we think of inside, about the inside and outside. And I'm not going through these today. I just want, because I want to bring in some other people that are doing something similar. So this is what I might call a systemese. Uh, that's a set of, well, there's some people say they like the top of, it's like a topological logic I sometimes play with. I haven't decided on a full name for this yet, but think of it as a topological, all-pervasive logic that doesn't have to be there. These are tools. They don't have to manifest, but they have, well, what Carolyn Levine calls affordances, which I'll bring up in a second. Well, this is just one figure from the book in the chapter on tubes and sheets, and the lines being a form of relationship. And on the left is a diagram of an Australian Aboriginal dreaming, which it's an interesting map because it's a map of somewhat of the reality of their landscape and also mythological mapping. In the middle is a icon of the American Agronomy Association, Society of Agronomy, and on the far right is the Kabbalah, the Jewish Kabbalah, mystical organization of the universe. And what you see here is that it's basically brain or mind mapping, circles and lines between concepts, and I find it of interest that we think this way. This might be something very deep in the mind, in the brain. This is just to remind you, remind myself that I wanted to say I've sometimes used the word superconvergence for some of these meta patterns, that the way we talk in biology of convergence, let's say of the wings of butterflies and bats being flat for large transfer of forces across the air. I think these meta patterns, they don't manifest because there's some kind of Platonic world that must be there must be there could be there doesn't have to be reasons. There could be you have to examine this. You could be arbitrary or it could be random, but in many cases one can make cases for either biological evolution, cultural evolution, mental evolution, manifesting these various patterns. And one of the interests is the mind-nature interaction is of a core interest. I think it's also to the Metatheory project. Bucky Fuller. Well, this is also from the book. Photo I took of Bucky Fuller lecturing, and he used to emphasize these two kinds of systems or polyhedra. He would show examples of one is strong because it has a center, and there's squares in this figure on the lower right, which he used to call the Dymaxion. But then on the upper left, I mean, excuse me, the upper right is the icosahedron. Oh, let's see, no, icosahedron is 20 sides. This is 10 points. Uh, Sorry about this. No, 12 points. So I mean, I'm pretty sure it's an icosahedron, but anyway, it's all triangulated. And the way this is my distributed systems versus centered systems. Uh, and an example, Niall Ferguson has this book, Square in the Tower. Sorry for the blur there, but it's a really interesting book. His square, he is a metaphor for the public square, distributed groups of people, and then the tower is his architectural metaphor. There on the cover is the piazza in Siena, Italy. The tower being a sense of centered and control. And he makes a case for weaving through history of these tensions between centralized control and decentralized networks, which both have advantages and disadvantages. And so this was an example. If he's right, either he's it's at least it's useful for him thinking about history. If he's right, then some of these patterns or manifest because of functionalities and dysfunctionalities. So there can be there can be going back and forth in the way that these patterns work. This is something, a book called Forms. I discovered, I don't know, maybe 5, 6 years ago. It's new. This woman, I have not met her, but she's a professor. I think she's moved now. I just looked her up recently. I think she moved somewhere else. But um, she wrote a book called Forms, Whole Rhythm, Hierarchy, and Network. And it really was a great read for me, which because her rhythm is my cycles, her hierarchy is my layers, her and network is in there. And just, also, she has a lot of dyads, a lot of binary systems that weave in and out. And she shows these patterns. She's using the word form after a translation of Plato's, I mean, after not translation of, but Plato's word, which is closer to the English idea, but often gets translated as forms. She uses that word. She discusses why she uses it, and she shows it in she shows these patterns being used, for example, in Charles Dickens. She goes a lot into politics. It's mostly literature, so it's very much culture and mind based. And so keep in mind her particular, well, it's four, but if you read her book, she's actually got more in there that were not explicitly put into the subtitle. I'm going to bring in a bit of International Society for System Science people who I really discovered after my book, Quarks to Culture, and George Mobus, who I'll show next, wrote me after reading the review of my book, Quarks to Culture. This was one of the leaders for decades and decades. He was a biologist. He passed away only in the last year, Len Troncale. And uh, I did get to know him in the last 5 years or so, and he made a whole thing about cycles. I was very excited about this because I had a whole chapter analyzing cycles into kinds, into types of cycles, and he had done the same thing. We had some similarities and some differences, and I think one thing that would be interesting for me to discuss with you all at the end is when we get to these very high level patternings, it's 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 difficult to well, Len and I, for example, we would discuss this seemingly small thing about whether a feedback cycle is a cycle. I mean, he was looking at matter and energy, and a lot of the other systems people were saying, well, of course, feedback cycle is a cycle. It says cycle. So these kinds of trying to parse kinds at this level, I find interesting and also tricky to come to decisive conclusions. But it's not to say that there's not conclusion because there's conversation that go around all these. Next is George Mobus, who's become a friend as a result of this work. He's written two large books for Springer Verlag. The most recent is Principles of, oh, excuse me, this is his earlier book because that was with a anthropologist. It was a humanities person, I believe it's anthropologist Michael Calton, Principles of System Science. He has a more recent book called System Science. And he likes to use on the lower left there, one of his expressions is that system science is a meta science, which I like very much. And I like the word metatheory very much as well. At the top is a diagram of one of his from his books, which is super illustrated. and I'm going to show something more of his in a minute. And he has used the word systemese for the way we think. And he claims that we think in very basic systems, topologies and dynamics, because it's been useful for the word. I just checked in with him. I thought he coined it, and I just checked in with him yesterday. And yes, he did coin it. He said he was basing it on Jerry Fodor's term, mentalese, which was a different concept, but George thought it should be expanded into something called systemese. And he's still actively working on this, he's told me. Uh, this is going to end the meta patterns part. The idea being that, and I think this could be relevant for meta theory, that there could be a small number of topological like principles which are useful to think about organizational structure in the world and how humans make organizational structure of various kinds. I show this, something I was very proud of. The last time I taught at NYU in the environmental studies department, I ran a course on meta patterns and the environment, and we went in depth through my book Meta Patterns, and the students did small projects off of all the patterns because I have found that you have to use them to well, using them is a lot better than just hearing about them, which of course is true in a lot of things. But they were tasked at the end to use some of the patterns and think about something of their own interest in the environment that they saw as an issue. And there were some really interesting papers in here. A woman wrote a paper on utopian metapatterns and was going through famous famous portrayals of utopia and comparing them through a metapatterns viewpoint. And just by skimming through the title, that there's the titles there, and then there's the meta patterns that the paper focused on. They didn't have to use all the meta patterns, but they had to use some of them into a system. So I was really happy with this work, and it seemed to work really well for the students, which strengthened my idea in this along these lines. A little bit on Gaia. I've attended major conferences on the Gaia hypothesis, wrote detailed papers on, well, let's see, the evolution of land plants and what that did to the carbon cycle. I put some of my ideas together into this book, Gaia's Body, and I want to say a few words about it that I think are relevant to the Metatheory project and also lead into the next topic of scales of evolution. I was involved with debates with Jim Lovelock about the organization of Gaia theory and debates about whether we can use maximum entropy production on a biosphere scale, which I claimed, no, we cannot do that. And then this was somewhat provocative. Gaia is life. This was summing up a bunch of work for a book on scientists debate Gaia, 2004, MIT. Gaia is life in a waste world of byproducts. And one of the Gaia people said to me, Tyler, you're 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 making me think that you're claiming it's like a landfill or something, that this organized biosphere is a waste world. Well, I go through and this is going to come in the next few slides, so I won't say more at this point, but this is related to the fact that many have talked about the evolution of the biosphere. And I'm going to talk about the term evolution in a bit. Well, the positive message of the idea being that there cannot be selection for or evolutionary selection of organisms that provide benefits when what they do is spreading out into these world-spanning matrices of atmosphere, oil, atmosphere, water, and sometimes soil, depending on how the soil is churned up. The ocean is circulating 1,000 years. The whole atmosphere is well mixed in about a 4-year cycle. So the carbon dioxide you breathe, I did a calculation, and the carbon dioxide you put out in a breath ends up into within a year every leaf on the planet somewhere statistically. It's sort of incredible to think about, but the calculation shows that. And I coined this term biochemical guilds. It was not my idea that species of organisms use each other's waste products. The famous example we all learn in third grade is the oxygen we breathe comes from plants as a waste product. But what I saw is that one could cluster these. This was somewhat from my modeling work. One could cluster groups of organisms, even though they might be in different taxonomic uh, um, areas. So bacteria can be in the same guild as a of a respirer as a bear or a mammal, but they can be put into biochemical guilds, and this is one way to look at the metabolism of Gaia. And I did this for nitrogen, sulfur, and carbon. And when I do this, I developed another concept called the cycling ratio. We all know that nature cycles really well. That carbon dioxide going into global photosynthesis, marine and terrestrial, is about 100 billion tons a year, while new carbon coming from rocks and volcanoes is about half a billion tons per year. So the use of waste products by these biochemical guilds sets up biochemical cycles, or what's called the biogeochemical cycles, and it amplifies life by a factor of 200 times. Now, that was not something, the end result was not selected for in any kind of way, but came a result, and this was related to what Brendan was asking me to talk about a little bit, the emergence in the biosphere scale through the hooking up of these waste products. Now you can have close hookups, like say a wasp fertilizing a certain species of fig tree, uh, very close coupling when it's direct benefits to the organisms, but not when it's spread out, when you get to the chemicals that are spread out. And yet there is, through biological evolution at the species or within the organism scales, we get this fantastically productive biosphere. So what does that mean? People talk about evolution of the biosphere, but it can't be the same kind, it cannot be the same kind of evolution as the evolution at the scales, the Darwinian evolution. There's the 200 times. Okay. No, this leads into the quarks to culture. And key for me was Jacob Bernowski early on with his Ascent of Man. He used the term stratified stability, atoms building into molecules, molecules building into cells. And he said he coined that term, stratified stability. And I did a little bit of this in the book Metapatterns, but I decided I really wanted to I wanted to could I count steps from the standard model of particle physics up to human culture? I had seen that the physicists talk about the scales of the onion, biologists talk about merging, let's say, of eukaryotic cells into complex multicellular organisms. Cultural anthropologists or archaeologists talk about agricultural villages merging into states. Could I count the steps in a way? Now, there are many people, and this is going to go into my work with Greg with his tree of knowledge on the upper right there. Uh, Larry's work, Orders of Nature, I did not know about when I published Metapatterns. I mean, excuse me, I published Quarks to Culture. It was only when I spoke at the Big History Society in 2019, Larry, as I told you, that somebody called out to me, I need to look at your book. And then we have George Mobus at the upper left, what he calls his ontogenic cycle, that goes around. And there's lots of others involved in this that I'd mentioned some of the names on the right who have built systems of nested scales going up from physics, biology into culture and mind. Uh, when I did this, I'm not going to go through this. I got 12 levels that I could defend. I'm not saying there are only 12 because we go from molecules to prokaryotic cells. I just said we don't know enough yet about the origin of life to make distinctions in that. But my idea was that with combogenesis, things and relations build a new thing that has it's larger and has new relations. These relations are I just need to emphasize one point. They're very general. They could be your mind having an idea of something you want to write about that you work on tomorrow. That's a relation you have with the universe. This is not just I draw wavy lines coming from a edge, but this is not meant to be just physics or just biological food webs, but this is anything you can say about an entity that involves its interactions with. I mean, this is very similar to what Greg, I think, calls behavior, for example, which is a term I like very much, behavior. So there could be new behaviors come about. So this was in a paper I published in the Journal of Big History, and Greg and I met through both publishing papers in the Journal of Big History. I didn't know about Greg's work until he had published a paper with some of the co-authors, who some of them might be here. Greg, I don't remember exactly who they were, in the Journal of Big History. But then I wrote a paper called The Metapattern of Evolutionary Dynamics, General Evolutionary Dynamics where you have propagation, variation, and selection. And my sort of caterpillar-like thing there is seeing where propagation, variation, and selection comes in. We don't know too much about chemical evolution, but it's hypothesized as almost having to exist to take molecules into cells. Once cells come about, we have standard biological evolution. In my book, I had brought in the fact that mentation by animals with trial and error and learning is a form of PVS dynamics. And then that I see that feeding into cultural evolution and getting advanced into more advanced learning in humans. So there's the internal. I claimed in the book. I claimed. I'm not. This is my synthesis. Trying to be humble. It's not my field, but reading the literature and then having experts review my chapters, that I was seeing cultural evolution as a dual as a I called it dual tier PVS, a mental PVS coupled to group PVS, which are agreement systems. And to me, this is very simpatico with when I read Greg's work. I was very excited because he specifically in his big history paper had blind variation and selective retention, Donald Campbell's term, but Greg's scales of justification systems, and in which there's internal mental justification, and then we have all kinds of social justification systems. And I like to make a point about it's yeses and nos, but in very subtle ways, and that's these selective processes. I'll return this at the end when I open up. And Greg, this is a position paper that Greg and I wrote together toward a Big History 2.0, in which we put our models or our maps together, and it's close to what I've already been describing, and many of you are very familiar with. PVSR is propagation, variation, and selective retention. What that term exactly is can be fluid, can still be discussed. So this is my final slide. And I want to get into the discussion. So these are my points that I think have some potential for the applied metatheory project. One is what you all think of this idea of a systemese, meta patterns. I did borrow the word from Gregory Bateson. I brought in the word forms. I showed some other people. There's correspondences, but not exactly. The linguist Ray Jackendorf has some really interesting work. I list some of his terms there. Lakoff and Johnson's metaphors we live by. I didn't bring that up, but they have the container metaphor, the path metaphor. So there's something I'm continuing working on this, by the way, that this idea of a of a set of topological principles that we use to very successfully map the world. And I'll just leave that at that for the discussion. Second point, the kinds of evolution. I brought up in my paper for the Journal of Big History. This is still something that is worth discussing by the big history folks. Uh, People use the word evolution in all kinds of ways, very loosely. Astrophysicists talk about galactic evolution. Sagan used the term cosmic evolution, which would be equivalent to big history. There's the personal mental evolution that Greg has done can really spread out into great detail. And then there's the specifically perhaps for the Metatheory project, if the word evolution means any kind of it doesn't have to be directed. That's a tricky word. Any kind of trend, which is how people use it very loosely. And then there's these subdivisions. Is is a major kind of evolution, propagation, variation, and selective retention. I like this concept because then you can ask specific questions about how does propagation take place, let's say in your mind or in culture, in biology. How does variation take place? So it allows us to do a family of evolutionary dynamics uh, that then has manifested in various ways because it's so great at creating form of patterns at work. And I'll leave it at that for the discussion. And then this term I'm currently using called Patternland. I'm developing some ideas about these are my own multi-physical objects. I'm doing some work with sameness and difference, timescales of possibility space. But in particular, what I'd like to leave for the meta theory project is do we do we are this relates to Systemese. I'm stumbling for words here a bit, but it's what I was calling things and relations. Steven Pinker's Blobs and Lines in his book, The Stuff of Thought, Larry Cahoon and Buckler's Natural Complexes, where I've been reading about that recently. Carnap, sorry, it's not a C, it's a P, 1928, Object in German, alles worüber eine Aussage gemacht werden kann. The object is anything you can make a statement about. The Ronald Langacker, the cognitive linguist, he uses the word entity for any that to subsume it. He calls it maximally applicable, subsumes anything we might have occasion to refer to for analytic purposes. And in all this, I think Greg's justification systems are directly relevant because of the emphasis on propositional spaces and judgments about propositional spaces of what I like to call, networks of things and relations. But I'm now seeing there's other people have terminology such as natural complexes, objects, and entity out there.